Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. After a highly successful G20 Leaders Summit in New Delhi on the 9th and 10th of September, India is now preparing for the G20 Virtual Summit later this year, which will mark the end of India's presidency. Brazil will take over the G20 presidency starting the 1st of December. In this 1 year as the G20 chair, India has strived to bridge divides, dismantle barriers and sow seeds of collaboration that nourish a world where unity prevails over discord and where shared destiny eclipses isolation. India's mantra of Vasudhaiva Kutumbukam, the world is one family, reflects in the 8 broad themes adopted in the New Delhi Leaders Declaration, giving an all-embracing outlook, encouraging the world to progress as one universal family, transcending borders, languages and ideologies. So we'll discuss each of these themes of the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration that call for human-centric progress in a series of episodes that we will be doing. The first and the foremost commitment made by the G20 leaders is achieving a strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth. It talks about the global economic situation, unlocking trade for growth, advancing financial inclusion and also fighting corruption. So we'll talk about all these aspects in this particular edition of Perspective with 2 eminent panelists joining me on the program. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sabyasachi Saha, Associate Professor, RIS. He's the co-chair, Life, Resilience and Values for Wellbeing. Dr. Saha, thank you very much for your time. And we're also delighted to welcome Dr. Shelley Kedia, Senior Fellow, Terry. She's also co-chair, Life, Resilience and Values for Wellbeing. Dr. Kedia, thank you very much for your time as well. Dr. Saha, allow me to begin the program today with you. So among the 8 broad themes of the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration, the first is about achieving strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth. Now, given the current global economic situation, we've had cascading crises. What is the approach that G20 leaders have adopted to promote inclusive growth primarily?
Thank you for having me on this show. And this is a very, very important theme that you have chosen. It is extremely crucial to decode the outcome of the G20 summit in New Delhi, which has been celebrated all across, because under current circumstances, there were a lot of negative press about the ability or the way it would go finally, but eventually the outcome was something that kind of changed the mood completely globally. It was, as Prime Minister said, the biggest problem at this point in time is trust deficit. And now, once you have a comprehensive outcome of the summit itself, it is an exercise in restoring faith, trust, cooperation, and unless multilateralism works, you cannot resolve some of the major global challenges that you see today. Growth is just one part of the problem. In the past few years after the pandemic, also interjected with a huge geopolitical crisis, focus has been on recovery, but the recovery has not been equal. Several countries were falling behind, and once you see several countries are falling behind, you don't have an equal world. You just cannot convince people to have faith in multilateralism. To bring back the faith in multilateralism, you need to have the fruits of multilateralism, you need to take them equally to people, and that's the role that India has played by bringing in the voice of the global south. So when we say sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth, it is growth for everyone and not for few. Though G20 was perceived to be a grouping of the economic powers, and several countries, least developed countries, were getting left behind, India took a major step under the guidance of Prime Minister to bring the issues of the global south right at the center of the G20 discussions. It has happened at multiple levels, from development finance to seeing how cooperation happens on trade integration, supply chain resilience, because each of these affects countries in the global south and their ability to participate in the world economy. So India has done a marvelous job in bringing all of them together. It goes without saying that inclusion of African Union only adds to the conviction that India has shown in the last during the entire presidency of bringing the voice of the global south center stage, and with the formal inclusion of African Union, you have a stronger urge to make the global macroeconomy deliver for the developing countries.
Absolutely, and there are several aspects that this theme of achieving strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth talks about. It also incorporates how the role of the private sector needs to be strengthened. So, we will discuss all of these aspects in just a bit. Let me get in Dr. Kedia into the discussion. Dr. Kedia, the point that Dr. Saha was making, that India's G20 presidency came at a very difficult time. The geopolitical divide was at its sharpest, but India gave an entire new perspective that we need to move forward as one family, and that inclusiveness was the buzzword. So, in terms of inclusion in the various challenges that the world today is facing, how do you see it reflecting, be it the women's inclusion, be it the inclusion of countries that were underrepresented for so long, or be it the inclusion of those voices that have been the most impacted by climate change, but they earlier found no voice at the global platform?
Thank you so much for having me here, and I completely agree with all the points made by my previous panelist. India started this G20 summit with a virtual summit called Voices of the Global South. And I think that itself shows that how serious India was in terms of ensuring that the outcomes of G20 was a very inclusive one, apart from that being balanced as well as sustainable. One report I'd just like to point out is the latest Sustainable Development Report points that because of the COVID situation, a very unique thing has happened in terms of the outcomes in the last 3 decades. It's for the very first time that the world has slided on key inclusion and inclusiveness related indicators like global inequality. And that to me is a very, very serious issue, and to address that, India has taken just not that it has come out with a very concrete outcome in terms of the G20 declaration, but it has specified very specific means that can take us through a more inclusive, sustainable and balanced growth, whether it is women-led development, whether it is digital public infrastructure, and all of these aspects reflect very clearly, not just in the final G20 declaration outcome, but in the individual working group outcomes, whether it is the development working group, whether it is the environment, climate and sustainable working group, whether it's the finance track, and all the kind of deliberations that took place. And of course, the inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member of G20 is certainly the crown jewel, which indeed resonates with what India's theme was, which is Vasudhaiva Kutumbukam, one world, one family and one future. And one remains very optimistic that India has set the norm, or the G20 norm, in the right direction, and made full use of the G20's convening power and collective resolve.
Absolutely, and that resolve will hopefully continue in the future declarations also, and we will see some kind of action. But let me take it point by point, as it's mentioned in the New Delhi Declaration. Dr. Saha, it recognizes that startups and MSMEs, they are natural engines of growth, and they're key to socio-economic transformation because they drive innovation, they create employment. So if I may understand from you, what have been India's efforts towards, number one, promoting this spirit of innovation, generating employment, and how has this approach resonated among the G20 leaders that it found place in the Leaders Declaration?
This is a very important point, because until and unless you have science, technology, innovation further strengthened in developing countries, you just cannot hold the growth that is required for the future. So, you need to create the sources of growth, and the sources of growth may not only come from the traditional factors of production. So, you need to innovate. Now, you need to also create institutions around that, you need to create the ecosystems around that. When India tried to place, as we have said earlier, that India's presidency was action oriented presidency. So, it was a solution centered approach, and the kind of solutions that India proposed and could convince others, agree on them, make it part of the declaration, including starting with digital public infrastructure, etc. You see, if you go read between the lines, if you go to various paragraphs of it, you see the outcomes of different working groups. You see that technology and innovation, digital access, digital technology has been the backbone of India's narrative of the G20 presidency. India has introduced Startup 20, and that comes from our own the confidence and the conviction that we have in the power of entrepreneurship. And as Prime Minister mentioned a few days back, that the number of startups has multiplied several times in the last starting from 2014 onwards. So you see a sea change in the landscape in the Indian economy itself, where we find the real talent, the skills and the value addition coming from. On the MSME component, as you see that the Trade and Investment Working Group that had a very successful run this year on several issues, starting with supply chains and others that were of critical importance. But India also introduced very focused kind of actions and outcomes on MSMEs. If we look at the Jaipur initiative on information for MSMEs and others, because we really understand we are a developing country, our definition of MSMEs are different from what we see in developed countries. We exactly know where it pinches, we exactly know how credit flows are important, how information asymmetries hold back their growth. So this is from practical experience in India that we could plug in the real issues in the agenda and not the superficial ones, or just restricting it to a kind of market access issues. You need to create the capacities to participate in trade and economy, and that is what India has done. And if you try to implement whatever has been accepted as part of this declaration, it will hugely change the economic trajectories in developing countries.
Okay, Startup 20 Engagement Group, Dr. Kedia, has been an important step. It's been established under India's G20 presidency. The manner in which we've seen the startup ecosystem grow and prosper in India. But the fact that startups in our country will be different from the other developed world, it will be different in the other emerging economies. So if we talk about strengthening the global startup ecosystem, number one, and how is it going to enable cross-border collaboration, because our needs will be different, we'll have different solutions to problems. So that kind of collaboration, to make it very, very effective, what is the approach?
Yes, so I think firstly India has taken the first very important step in having that as an important part of the discourse, having startups as an important part of the discourse, having MSMEs as a part of the discourse. And of course, since they are very key to supply chains, there is also a need for greater collaboration. And of course, when you talk about greater collaboration, considering that aspect of supply chain, it is very important that they also get access to information, and this whole thrust on digital public infrastructure, I think this will enable greater collaboration, greater information sharing, reducing search costs, etc. So I think that is very core to what one talks about collaboration involving startups, involving MSMEs. But apart from that, the other important and notable aspect is the financial ecosystem that should be conducive to MSMEs and startups. And whether it is access through microfinance institution or reforms in the multilateral development space, that is also very crucial when it comes to the startup ecosystem, because often we see in the global south, not just in India but other countries as well, MSMEs do face this issue about of inadequate access to credit. And I think the pathway that has been laid out through India's G20 presidency is the right step forward.
Okay, the other aspect, Dr. Saha, that I would like you to touch upon is the agreement that the G20 leaders had on promoting inclusive and balanced growth in the area of trade, wherein they reaffirmed that a rules-based, fair, non-discriminatory, open, inclusive, equitable, sustainable and transparent multilateral trading system with WTO at its core. Now, of course, India has been pushing for reforms at the WTO because there are several times when things get stuck at the WTO. how did it resonate among G20 leaders? Was there consensus on urgent need for reforms at the WTO and to ensure that it is more inclusive in nature, something that India has ensured and given an example first by expansion of BRICS, then by expansion of the G20 by including the African Union. But at the WTO, things to move fast and move for the welfare of the developing countries?
Well, India takes WTO very seriously because as it is one of the most representative multilateral institutions. So, all countries have equal vote. So, that is something that is extremely crucial in a world where we see protectionist tendencies, where we see proliferation of plurilateral agreements, bilateral trading arrangements, etc. But that won't lead to actually empowering people and based in developing countries, because many of these bilateral agreements, the plurilateral agreements, doesn't really adhere to the norms of special and differential treatment. So, India is very keen to have the space for special and differential treatment as part, because it is a WTO agreement. The space for it has been reducing over time because of narrow nationalist interests, protectionist tendencies, and the tendency to strike trade deals within smaller groups. But it really does not help the developing countries that are catching up at different levels of development. So, you need to give them the space to develop and come up, and that is the spirit of special and differential treatment, which has eroded over time. And until and unless we restore faith in WTO and take it out of just in spirit, it has served its role to a great extent, but the reforms process is something that one needs to invest in, and India needs to give the leadership, because developing countries need to have a leader. In developing countries need to have their own coalitions. In WTO in the past has seen several coalitions coming up, but on WTO reforms there is an urgent need to have a coalition of developing countries. Absolutely. And I think from the taking the inspiration from the New Delhi Leaders Declaration, the commitment that all G20 members have made with the inclusion of the African Union, India should now open a dialogue with African Union. That could be one of the first steps that G20 should do while they induct African Union within its fold. So, within this process, having a consensus on trade issues and WTO reforms is extremely important, and this is the right time. India should push for it, and G20 countries should be favorably disposed to the idea of WTO reforms.
Absolutely.
Taking the views of developing countries.
Right. When we are talking about rapid growth and advancing financial inclusion, these multilateral institutions need to reflect the 21st century reality, and that is something that India has been pushing for. Dr. Keria, the fact that we are talking about sustainability, inclusive growth, but if we look at our approach towards the SDGs, so in terms of time period, we are advancing fast, but whereas the truth is in terms of progress, we've been lagging behind. What was the G20 approach, and what has been the New Delhi Leaders Declaration approach towards rapidly accelerating the advancement of the 2030 goals?
Yes, that is a very important question, and the fact remains that G20 India's presidency came about at the midpoint year of the Agenda 2030 timeline, and accelerating progress of SDGs was a very big priority for India. And as was mentioned, it was advocated by India that it is done through various means, like whether it is women-led development, whether it is data-led development, but also when it comes to finance, developed countries meeting their ODI commitments, which also is kind of very off track. But more importantly, it laid some few things very clear. When we talk about, for instance, energy transitions, the aspect of $4 trillion being there on the table for energy transitions, or when we talk about climate change, the minimum need of $5.8 to $5.9 trillion, that being on the table. So, these are very key aspects that are very important towards realizing of SDGs, because here we are facing the simultaneously for SDGs facing the challenge of climate change. And one of the trust aspect that was kind of firstly the climate commitment of even the bare minimum of $100 billion hasn't been fulfilled. So that has been reiterated. The doubling of adaptation finance has been reiterated. So these are extremely core to the 2030 development agenda as well as climate action.
Okay. Another last aspect that we would like you to talk about, Dr. Saha, is fighting corruption. So the G20 leaders reaffirmed their commitment to zero tolerance for corruption. What has been India's roadmap towards this particular aspect? And if we talk about the global efforts that are also being undertaken by the G20, particularly in fighting corruption?
Corruption has various manifestations, as you can imagine, and India, right from the time when Prime Minister took office back in 2014, this has been one of the key areas where good governance and welfare of citizens have been the focus. And India tried to build on this agenda even at the international forum, because when you see least developed countries, African nations, there is a huge problem of illicit financial flows. They just cannot benefit from the revenues generated in their own land. So there was a huge problem of illicit financial flows, transfer pricing, etc. The taxation, norm setting on taxation was primarily held by the Paris Club and the more wealthy nations. Tax havens were just being not being any kind of censorship on tax havens across the world. India took a very strong position back in 2015 at the Financing for Development conference in Addis Ababa. So India's position on corruption, particularly with regard to illicit financial flows, strengthening domestic resource mobilization systems, and for that, as you see, leveraging technology is one of the key aspects. So India has been quite consistent in its efforts on giving to its people a corruption-free governance system, and how its own solutions could benefit others, apart from bringing norm setting on corruption at a multilateral stage with a more inclusive approach, and not within the vested interests that we see currently.
Also, how efficient has been the United Nations Convention Against Corruption? When we say corruption is an important aspect and it finds place in the leaders' declaration. So in terms of legally binding frameworks, how effective has this body been?
Always has a committee system, as you know, on several matters, and the way forward is to strengthen UN, strengthen some of these activities that are mandated for UN, but is being kind of controlled from other places, and UN not having its due place in terms of the delivery that is needed. So India has always been supportive of strengthening UN, particularly on some of these matters where you need the representation of the developing countries, very small countries sometimes who lack the technical wherewithal to participate sometimes in such sophisticated negotiations. So India has been very keen that UN should be strengthened, and the delivery on some of these issues should be taken back to UN and not in any other place.
Okay, so we've spoken largely about the aspects mentioned in this particular theme, Dr. Kedia, but overall, how Dr. Saha also described India's approach is very development oriented, very action oriented. The key will lie in the implementation. How will we ensure, we still have about 2 months to go, we are planning for a virtual summit. How will we ensure that the consensus that we achieved at the physical summit, Leaders Summit, that translates into some kind of action for the G20?
Yes, very rightly pointed that that any commitment has to actually translate into implementation. And to that end, I would say that there are some very specifics, in terms of what we call as the means of implementation that has come out in terms of the actual implementation. And if we look at the outcome documents of various other working groups, those are very specific. And the one very important feature is that India has taken a target and goal driven approach. So just to give you an example, when we talk about degraded land, the agreement has been that 30% of degraded land, whether it's from forest fires or whether it's from mining areas, should be under land degradation by 2030. And we feel that this approach, when you talk about targets and goals, this is actually what drives implementation and action. So to that end, I would say that it was India's G20 presidency was not about just high-level statements, but about setting concrete targets. Even when we talk about tripling renewable energy efficiency or doubling, or talking about the degraded lands. So I think, you know, it has taken a very implementation, action-related based approach, because targets is what drive action and implementation.
Absolutely. So that having been said, we'll have to wind up the program. Time allows me to take up only that much on this edition of Perspective. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on this edition of Perspective, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. And to you viewers, thank you very much for your time as well. I'll see you same time tomorrow now. Take good care of yourselves. Keep watching Sansad TV.